The chair scrapes back across the boards, and for the length of one breath the whole hall forgets to make any sound at all. A married woman is on her feet. In this town, in this year, that is very nearly enough. The men along the front benches turn first, the way men turn when something has gone wrong with the order of a room. Then the women turn, and their faces are harder to read, because some of them are afraid for her, and some of them are afraid of her, and a few of them, in the half-second before they arrange their expressions, are simply afraid. She has not said a word. She has only stood, in a respectable gray dress with the collar buttoned to the throat, in a meeting, where it had been understood that the speaking would be done by men, and by the one famous lady on the platform, who was paid in insults to do it. And by standing, she has spent something that cannot be earned back. We will call her Sarah. The name is a convenience. The life was real enough, lived in its particulars by women whose names the record happened to keep, and by thousands whose names it did not, in the garrison towns and the dockyard ports along the English coast in the 1870s and 80s, where for 20 years a set of laws had made a certain kind of woman the property of the state, and where, in the year 1880, the fight to undo those laws was still being lost more often than it was won. To understand what it cost Sarah to stand up, you have to understand what she was standing up with, not money. She had almost none of her own, and we will come to why. What she had, what every woman of her sort had, was a reputation, and a reputation was not a feeling or a flattery. It was capital. It was the only capital a respectable woman was permitted to accumulate, and like any capital it could be saved, invested, lent against, and lost, and once lost it did not come back at compound interest, or at any interest at all. A man could fail in business and begin again. A man could drink and reform and be received. A woman's good name was a single coin, minted once, in girlhood, and spent once, the moment it was questioned. Everything in the way she had been raised had been arranged to keep that coin bright and to keep it in her pocket. So think of her earlier, 15 years before that meeting, a girl in the same town, the daughter of a shopkeeper or a clerk or a foreman at the yard, somewhere in that anxious band between the laboring poor and the comfortable middle that had the most to lose because it had only just acquired anything to lose at all. Her schooling had been short and shaped less toward knowledge than toward conduct. She had been taught to walk a particular way, to keep her eyes at a particular angle, to be in the house before a particular hour, to be seen with particular people and never seen with others. She had been taught that the most valuable thing about her was a kind of absence, an absence of incident, of gossip, of any story that could attach to her name. A girl with no story was a girl with a future. The future was marriage, and marriage was not romance, though it might contain romance the way a house might contain a fire. Marriage was the transaction by which a woman exchanged the reputation she had guarded for the security only a husband could legally provide. She brought her good name to the altar the way a man might bring a small inheritance, and the man, in return, brought his protection and his wage and his standing in the town. It was understood to be a fair exchange. It was understood that she had the worse end of it, and that the price of the worse end was silence about the worse end. Stop there for a moment, because this is the thing the whole story turns on, and it is a thing we have nearly lost the ability to feel. If any of this has already begun to put a weight in your chest, leave a comment and tell me whose face you saw when I described that hall. A grandmother, a great-aunt, a woman from your own town's old photographs. This channel exists to put those faces back into the room. I want to know which one came to you. Sarah married in her early 20s, which was considered neither early nor late, to a man a few years older who held a respectable post. A clerk in the dockyard administration, let us say, or the manager of a draper's, the kind of position that depended entirely on being thought sound. His name and his living and his good standing in the chapel and the town were the roof over them both, and that roof had been raised in part on her account, because a man who married a girl of unimpeachable name was himself confirmed as a man of judgment. Her reputation was not only hers after the wedding, it had become an annex of his. This is the part that is almost impossible to translate into the language we use now, so I will say it as plainly as the law said it. When Sarah married, she ceased, in a precise legal sense, to exist. The doctrine was called coverture, and it was not a metaphor. Under the common law of England as it still stood in 1880, a wife was a femme covert, a woman covered, her legal person folded into her husband so completely that the two were held to be one, and that one was him. She could not own property in her own right. Whatever she had brought to the marriage, whatever she earned by her own labor if she worked, whatever she might inherit, passed to her husband or fell under his control. She could not make a contract, she could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not, in the fullest sense, be robbed by him, because a man cannot steal what is already his, and what was already his included her wages, her possessions, and her body. The Married Women's Property Act that would begin to undo the worst of this was 2 years away, in 1882, and even it would only begin. In the year Sarah stood up in that hall, a married woman's earnings were her husband's to take, and the law that took them did not consider this a wrong. It considered it the natural shape of marriage, as gravity is the natural shape of a falling thing. So when we say she had nothing of her own with which to stand up, we are not being poetic. She had no money the law would recognize as hers, no separate legal existence to act from, no standing in any court except through him. The only thing she possessed that the law could not directly reach into her husband's pocket and confiscate was her name, and her name, by marriage, had become half his too. Now bring the laws into it, the real ones, the ones with dates. For most of Sarah's married life there had been on the statute books a set of measures known as the Contagious Diseases Acts, passed first in 1864 and strengthened in 1866, and again in 1869. On paper, they were a public health response to a military problem. The Army and the Navy were being hollowed out by venereal disease. In some garrisons, 1 soldier in 3 was unfit for duty with it. The acts proposed to fix this, but they proposed to fix it by reaching for the women. In the subjected districts, the garrison towns and the naval ports, the places like the one Sarah lived in, a plainclothes officer of a special police could identify any woman he judged to be a common prostitute, and the standard of judgment was his own eye. He did not need a charge. He did not need evidence in the sense a court would later demand it. He needed only suspicion, and a woman who walked alone after dark, or spoke to a soldier, or was poor and out of doors and unaccompanied, could meet the standard. Once identified, she was required to register, and once registered, she was subject to a compulsory examination of her body, conducted with an instrument, at fixed intervals, whether she consented or not. If she was found to be diseased, she could be confined in what was called a lock hospital for 3 months under the early acts and for as long as 9 under the later one. If she refused the examination, she could be brought before a magistrate, and the magistrate could compel her, and the refusal itself was treated as a kind of guilt. The men were not examined. The soldiers and the sailors who carried the disease into the town and out of it again, who were its actual reservoir and its actual vectors, were left entirely alone. The whole machinery of inspection and detention was pointed in one direction only, at the bodies of poor women, on the suspicion of a policeman, with no trial worth the name. The campaigners who came to fight the acts called the examination by a word that the newspapers would not always print. They called it instrumental rape. They called the instrument itself the steel. They said, and they were not exaggerating for effect, that the state had built a procedure by which a poor woman could be seized on a man's word and held down and entered by a tool of metal, lawfully, for the protection of the army, and that the law did not regard this as an injury, because the law did not regard such women as fully real. Sarah had known about the acts the way one knows about a thing that happens to other people. She was respectable. She was married. She walked out with her husband or with other women of her sort, in daylight, on errands that explained themselves. The special police were not looking at her. The horror of the system was kept, by design and by class, at a careful distance from women like Sarah, and that distance was itself part of how the system survived, because the women it touched had no name to lose, and no voice the town would credit, and the women who had names and voices were not touched. Until the distance failed. It failed, as these things usually fail, through a person. Perhaps it was a young woman who had been in service in Sarah's own house, a maid of 17 or 18, dismissed for some small thing, or let go when money was short, who drifted into the half-world of casual work and casual men that swallowed so many girls with no character and no situation, and who was taken up one night on a policeman's say-so and put through the register and the examination, and came out of it altered in a way that Sarah, seeing her again by chance, could not pretend not to see. Or perhaps it was nearer than that. Perhaps it was a sister, or a cousin, or the daughter of a friend, a respectable enough girl caught out alone at the wrong hour, mistaken, the police later half admitting the mistake and doing nothing to repair it, because there was nothing in the acts that required them to. It does not matter which. What matters is that the abstraction acquired a face, and the face was one Sarah knew, and once she had seen it, she could not get free of the arithmetic. The same officer who had taken that girl could, on the same standard of suspicion, on a bad night and a wrong corner, have taken anyone. The wall between Sarah and that table was not made of stone. It was made of luck and of class, and class was only luck with money on it. This is the point at which she might have done what almost everyone did, which was to look away and be grateful for the wall while it held. Most people did exactly that, and we should not be too quick to despise them for it, because they had the same single coin to protect, and far more reason than we have to know what its loss would cost. But Sarah, for whatever reason, a hard streak of fairness, a faith that took the word neighbor seriously, a refusal that she herself might not have been able to explain, did not look away. And there were, by then, meetings she could go to. The campaign against the axe had a leader, and her name was Josephine Butler, and what Josephine Butler did is the thing that made what Sarah did imaginable. Butler was a clergyman's wife, educated, respectable, devout, and she had chosen to stand up in public halls across the country and speak aloud, in front of mixed audiences of men and women, about prostitution, about venereal disease, about the examination and the instrument and the bodies of poor women. No respectable woman did this. The doing of it was itself the scandal, almost more than the content, because the deepest assumption of the age was that a decent woman did not know such things existed, and that a woman who knew enough to speak about them had been contaminated by the knowing. To stand on a platform and name the speculum was, in the logic of the time, to confess that you were the kind of woman who had reason to know what a speculum was. Butler was spat at. She was mobbed. At a by-election in Colchester in 1870, the crowd hunting her was violent enough that she had to be hidden, moving between lodgings in disguise, while the inn she had been staying in was attacked. At Pontefract 2 years later, a meeting she addressed was stormed. The floor of the room was set smoldering beneath the women. Filth was thrown, and she went on. She was, for years, one of the most hated women in England, and what she was hated for, at bottom, was not her opinions. It was that she had stood up and spoken, as a woman, about the body, in public, and so had broken the silence that the whole arrangement depended on. Annie Besant, in those same years, was learning what the breaking cost in a different currency. In 1877, Besant and Charles Bradlaugh had deliberately republished a pamphlet on contraception, to force a trial and test the law that called such knowledge obscene. Besant spoke in her own defense, brilliantly. A woman standing in a courtroom discussing the prevention of conception in front of the entire press of London. She was convicted, and though the conviction was later quashed on a point of procedure, the cost arrived by another door. Her estranged husband used the trial, and her unbelief, to take their daughter from her. In 1878, the court agreed that a woman who would stand up and say such things in public was not a fit person to raise her own child, and Besant lost the girl. She had spoken, and they took her daughter as the price. These were the women whose example reached Sarah, and whose fates, if she let herself think about them, told her exactly what she was risking. She went to the meetings anyway. For a while she only went. She sat at the back, among the other women, and listened. And the listening was already a small transgression that she kept from her husband, not because he forbade it in so many words, but because both of them understood, without words, that it was the kind of thing a man in his position would rather his wife did not do. Listening, she could have continued indefinitely. Listening cost nothing the world could see. And then came the evening in 1880, when she stood up. Before we follow her into it, let me say one plain thing to you, because we are about to watch a life close, and I would rather you came back for the next one. If you want this channel to keep finding the people the records nearly threw away, the ones who paid for a single act of courage with everything they had, and who no one has spoken of since, then subscribe, so the next one finds you. That is the whole of the ask. Now, the meeting. We do not know exactly what was said from the platform that made her rise. Perhaps a speaker, a man, had described the examination in the careful, distancing language men used, and a heckler had called out something coarse, and the men around him had laughed. The easy laugh of people for whom the women in question were not quite people. Perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps the famous lady on the platform had asked in so many words where the respectable women of the town were, and why they would not lend their own untouchable names to the defense of women who had no names to lend. Whatever it was, Sarah found herself on her feet, with her heart going like a fist on a door, and she heard her own voice in the silence she had made, and she said the things. She said she knew a girl. She said the girl had done nothing, or nothing worse than be poor and be out, and that the law had taken her on a man's word, and used her like an object and given her nothing back. Not even an apology, not even her name returned to her clean. She may have said the word that the newspapers would not print. She certainly said enough that everyone in the room understood that a respectable married woman, the wife of a known man, was standing up and speaking aloud about the examination of women's bodies, about disease, about the traffic between soldiers and the girls of the town, in a voice that shook but did not stop. She spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, and then she sat down, into a silence that had changed its nature while she stood, and she knew at once, with the certainty of a person who has been raised her whole life to read exactly this, that she had spent the coin. What happened next did not happen all at once, and that was the cruelty of it. A blow you can brace for. This was not a blow. It was a slow withdrawal of the air. It began with the small things that are not small. The woman who had nodded to her at chapel did not, the following Sunday, quite catch her eye. The draper's wife, with whom she had been on terms of easy borrowing of patterns and exchange of news, was a little busy when Sarah called, and a little busy the next time, until busyness hardened into a wall that was never named as a wall, and so could never be argued with. Invitations thinned. A tea she would ordinarily have been asked to went ahead without her, and she heard of it afterward, which was worse than not hearing. None of this was cruelty exactly. It was self-protection. Each of these women had her own single coin, and proximity to a woman who had publicly spent hers was a risk to the value of one's own, and so they stepped back. Not from malice, but from the same arithmetic that had nearly kept Sarah herself in her seat. She understood it perfectly. Understanding it did not make the room any warmer. And then the old story came back, because there is always an old story. There is no woman alive who reaches her 30s without something in her past that can be picked up and turned in the light until it looks like something else. A walk taken once with the wrong young man, a position left under a small cloud, a season when money was tight and choices were narrow. In Sarah's case, it might have been nothing more than a youthful attachment that had ended and been forgotten, a courtship that came to nothing, the kind of thing every girl had and no one remarked on, because reputation works by silence, and as long as the silence held, the thing did not exist. But she had broken the silence herself, up on her feet in that hall, and once a woman has shown that she is the kind who will speak of forbidden things, the town goes back through her life looking for the proof it now feels entitled to find. The forgotten attachment was remembered. It was discussed. It was reread, not as the innocent thing it had been, but as the first sign of what she had now revealed herself to be. A woman who knew too much, who had perhaps always known too much, whose interest in those fallen girls was now murmured to be a little too personal, a little too informed. She had said she knew a girl. Well, how did a respectable wife come to know such a girl so well? You see how it works. The knowledge that should have marked her as compassionate was turned, by the simple fact that she was a woman who had it, into evidence against her chastity. This was the engine Josephine Butler had named and fought. Sarah was now inside it. Her husband was inside it too, and that was the part she had perhaps not fully let herself foresee. He was not a cruel man. This is important, because it would be easier if he were. A brute we can dismiss. He was an ordinary man, who loved her in the ordinary, undeclared way of his time and place, and whose entire standing in the world rested on a foundation she had just put a crack through. His position depended on being thought sound, and a man whose wife stood up in public meetings and spoke of venereal disease and police, and the bodies of fallen women, was not, by the measure of his employer and his chapel and his street, entirely sound. The whispers that reread her past were rereading his judgment. The man who had married a girl of unimpeachable name to confirm himself a man of judgment now found himself married, in the eyes of the town, to a woman whose name was a question, and the question attached to him. He did not beat her. He did something quieter and, in its way, harder to survive. He went silent. He came home, and the warmth that had been the small daily currency of the marriage was simply not paid out. He did not forbid her the meetings. He did worse. He ceased to ask where she had been, because to ask would be to acknowledge a wife whose movements he no longer felt able to govern, and a man of his time would rather feel the loss in silence than name it aloud. They went on living in the same rooms, they ate at the same table, and the table got longer, in the way a table does when two people stop reaching across it. She could not leave, and here the law closes the last door. Remember coverture. She had no property of her own, no earnings the law would let her keep, no separate legal existence to act from. A woman in an unhappy marriage in 1880 did not simply go. There was almost nowhere to go to, and almost nothing to go with. And divorce, the word we reach for now, was for her a fantasy with a wall around it. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 had created civil divorce, it is true, but it had built into the law the same double standard that ran through everything else. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery, plainly, on that ground alone. A wife could not divorce her husband for adultery alone. She had to prove his adultery and something more: cruelty, or desertion of 2 years and upward, or one of a short list of further enormities, before the court would so much as hear her. The law looked at a man's unfaithfulness and a woman's, and saw two different sizes of thing, and in any case Sarah had no grievance of that kind to bring, and no money to bring it with, and no wish, even now, to break the marriage rather than the silence. She had not stood up to leave her husband. She had stood up to say a true thing about a wrong done to women poorer than herself. The marriage was simply the ground that gave way beneath her when she did. So she stayed, and the years went on, and the shape of her life narrowed to fit the smaller room the town had left her. She kept the house. She did the work that married women did and that the law gave her no wages for. She was civil to the women who were civil to her, and she stopped expecting more. She did not, as far as we can tell, stand up again. Once was enough to spend. There was nothing left to spend a second time. The famous lady moved on to the next town. The meetings went on without Sarah in them, and the thing she had stood up for, the actual cause, ground forward at the pace such things grind, indifferent to what it had cost the individual women who lent it their one coin along the way. That is the part that is hard to sit with, and I am not going to soften it for you, because the prompt I write by, and the whole point of this channel, is that we do not invent comfort the past did not provide. Sarah did not get a triumph. There was no scene in which the town saw the error of its ways and came to her door. The campaign she had spoken for did, in the end, win. The compulsory examinations were suspended in 1883, and the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed entirely in 1886, 6 years after she stood up. The instrument was put away. The special police lost their power. Women in the garrison towns could walk after dark again without belonging, on a stranger's suspicion, to the state. It was a real victory, and it mattered, and it freed real bodies from a real machine. And Sarah was not in the hall when it was announced, because Sarah, by then, was a woman it was understood one did not invite, and her name, when it came up at all, came up in the lowered voice reserved for women who had been not quite respectable, no one now able to say exactly why, only that there had been something, years back, something about a meeting. She had been right. That was the thing that no one would say, and that she perhaps could not let herself dwell on, because being right had not saved her and had not been meant to. The country agreed with her, in the end, and built its agreement into the law, and the women who had spoken first were remembered as pioneers or forgotten as troublemakers, more or less at random, depending on whether the record happened to keep them. Butler is remembered. Besant is remembered. The thousands of Sarahs, the ordinary wives in the ordinary towns who stood up once and paid in full and never made a second speech, are not remembered at all, because the price they paid was precisely the kind of price that removes a person from the record, the slow erasure of a respectable woman from the respectable world, leaving not a scandal large enough to write down, but only an absence, a name that stopped appearing on the lists of who was asked and who was seen. We can do one small thing for her, which is to understand exactly what she did. She did not do something large. She stood up in a room and spoke for 2 minutes. By the standards of courage we usually celebrate, the soldiers and the explorers, and the men who signed their names to declarations, it is almost nothing. but measure it in the only currency she had. She had no money of her own, and no legal self, and no way out of her marriage, and one single coin, her name, minted in girlhood, and meant to be spent only once, at the altar, on security. And she took that coin, the only thing in the world that was hers, and she spent it on a girl who was no relation to her, on a principle, on a truth about other women's bodies that no one was making her say. She knew the price. She had watched Butler pay it in the streets, and Besant pay it in the loss of a child. She stood up anyway. It is one of the quietest, brave things a person can do, and it is the kind history almost never keeps. And that is exactly why we keep coming back to these rooms, to stand for a moment where she stood, in the hush after the chair scraped back, and to say, late and useless and meant, we know what you spent, and we know it was yours, and we know what it bought. The hall is empty now. It was pulled down, probably, or turned into something else a long time ago. But for the length of one breath, before she spoke, the whole room forgot to make any sound at all. Let it stay quiet a moment longer. Then let her sit down.